All right, so we are going to be going through Acts chapter 15 today. Acts chapter 15. So, what is this chapter all about? Well, Acts 15 recounts the events of what is called the Jerusalem Council. And to give a very quick summary of the Jerusalem Council, this council was convened by the Jewish apostles and elders in Jerusalem, hence the Jerusalem Council. And this council addressed a very important question. What was that question? That question was, is it necessary to circumcise the Gentile believers and order them to keep the law of Moses? We see that in verse 5. Is it necessary to circumcise the Gentile believers and order them to keep the law of Moses? Some members of this council, particularly from the Pharisees, said that it was necessary. But what did the apostles say? What was their answer to this question? Well, as we keep reading, we see that the apostles decide that the Gentile believers must follow 4 commandments. We see this in verse 20. The apostles conclude that Gentile believers must, 1, abstain from things polluted by idols, so don't eat meat that has been offered to an idol. 2, abstain from sexual immorality. 3, abstain from strangled things. And 4, to abstain from blood. Okay, what's all that about? What do these 4 commandments have to do with the original question about circumcision and the Torah for Gentiles? Well, we're going to talk about all of that today. We are going to nerd out with the word out. I'm going to hit you guys with a ton of information, and we're going to go through all of Acts 15 to try to understand what this dispute was all about. What is this decision that was made by the apostles? What does that mean? And what does that decision imply regarding the Gentile believers' relationship with the Torah? So we're going to talk about all of that, and depending on how you may have heard Acts 15 explained in the past, what we discover may surprise you. What do I mean? Well, a very common interpretation of Acts 15 that you may have heard is that the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15 represents the apostles' rejection of the law of Moses. It represents their rejection of the law of Moses, at least for Gentile believers. According to this common interpretation, Acts 15 proves that the Torah has nothing to say to Gentile followers of Yeshua, and instead of keeping the Torah, Gentile believers are to keep a separate, smaller set of commandments, namely the 4 commandments that I mentioned earlier in verse 20. So, in this message, I want to challenge that common interpretation. I will argue that the apostles' decision in Acts 15 does not imply that the Torah is done away with or irrelevant to Gentile believers. Actually, it implies precisely the opposite. What I hope to demonstrate is that the Jerusalem Council provided Gentile believers a starting point for Torah observance, and they expected that the Gentile believers would continue to grow in Torah observance over time. So, by the way, I want to give a quick shout out to my boy, Benjamin Frostad. He's a PhD candidate at McMaster University, and his master's thesis was actually on this chapter in Acts 15. And so I'm drawing heavily from his work. But if you want to get really detailed and into the scholarship on this passage, I highly recommend checking out his master's thesis. I made a website called TorahMatters.com, and I posted his master's thesis there along with a ton of other scholarly resources, so you can check that out if you want to get more information. But in any case, as I've already mentioned, my interpretation of this passage is quite different than the common interpretation, right? It's quite different than what you commonly hear this passage means. And if you've never heard a pronomian or a pro-law approach to Acts 15 before, you might be thinking that it's kind of a stretch. After all, the Pharisees said it was necessary to circumcise the Gentiles in order them to keep the law of Moses. the apostles disagreed with the Pharisees. Therefore, it seems reasonable that the apostles did not think the law of Moses applied to Gentiles. I mean, I get it. That seems like kind of a straightforward conclusion. However, there are good reasons to question that common interpretation. So before we jump into Acts 15, there are a few problems that I want to mention at the outset here. And perhaps these things that I'm going to mention will, at the very least, cause us to pause before automatically accepting that common view that we've heard. And maybe it will invite us to consider an alternative, okay? So first, as I mentioned, it is often assumed that Acts 15 represents the apostles' rejection of the Torah. Instead of the law of Moses, the apostles gave the Gentiles 4 rules to obey. This quote comes from R.L. Solberg, and he's representative of this position. He says, quote, "Rather than the law of Moses, James offered 4 things from which they were to abstain. The rest of the elders and apostles agreed, and together they drafted a letter informing Gentile believers of this decision. How can Torah keepers teach that the law of Moses is binding on all believers when Scripture says that it isn't?" End quote. All right, so that's representative of this common view. Solberg is convinced that the apostles did not apply the law of Moses to Gentile believers. Instead, they gave Gentile believers a smaller, separate set of rules that I guess they made up or whatever. All right? The problem with this interpretation is that the apostles did not make up these rules. They did not pull these 4 commandments out of thin air. Where did they come from? Well, we find these 4 commandments that the apostles impose upon the Gentile believers right in the law of Moses, specifically in Leviticus 17 through 18. In other words, the apostles derived these 4 commandments for Gentile believers from the Torah. Why is this significant? Because this fact refutes the claim that the law of Moses is not binding on Gentile believers. Acts 15, verse 20, proves that the apostles did require Gentile believers to obey the law of Moses. In particular, they imposed 4 Torah commandments upon the Gentiles, 3 of them pertaining to food, by the way. 3 of the laws they gave are food laws. So, that kind of is problematic for the common idea that God doesn't care about what we eat. So, if the apostles wanted to say that the Torah does not apply to Gentiles, why did they apply it to Gentiles? That's like saying, instead of keeping the Torah, keep the Torah. Obviously, that doesn't make any sense. And so, it's a big problem for the common interpretation. A second problem is the next verse, in verse 21. That verse reads, quote, "For from ancient generations Moses has had in every city those who proclaim him, for he is read every Sabbath in the synagogues." End quote. All right, so I'll have more to say about this verse later on in this message, but already we can see that there is a problem here. There's a problem in claiming that Acts 15 makes the Torah irrelevant to Gentiles. Why? Well, verse 21 starts with the word "for," which in Greek is gar. And what this is an explanatory conjunction. Basically, that means that verse 21 is intended to offer clarification or justification for what James just said in verse 20, and in verse 20 where he gives the 4 commandments, okay? So James says that Gentiles are to keep these 4 Torah commandments, for the Torah is proclaimed every Sabbath in the synagogues. All right? Like I said, I'll address this verse in more detail later, but here we see that the Gentiles walking out their faith, doing these 4 commandments, somehow, in some way, it involves hearing the law of Moses proclaimed every Sabbath in the synagogues. All right? So the law of Moses is relevant to these Gentiles. A third problem is that beyond Acts 15, we see evidence that both the Messiah and the apostles expected Gentiles to obey the law of Moses. For instance, In Matthew 28, verse 20, this is part of the Great Commission, right? When Yeshua, he's about to ascend to heaven, and he tells his disciples, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations." Well, part of that Great Commission was to teach all nations to obey all that I have commanded you. That's part of the commission that he gave his disciples. Well, what does all Yeshua commanded entail? That would entail his teachings, right? Including his Sermon on the Mount several chapters earlier. Well, what does the Sermon on the Mount say? It includes Matthew 5, 17 through 20, where Yeshua urges his followers to do and teach the law of Moses, even the least of the commandments. So all that Yeshua commanded includes Matthew 5, 17 through 20, where he affirms the ongoing relevance of the law of Moses and tells his followers to do and teach it. And this was to be passed on to his future Gentile disciples of the nations when the disciples went out, in obedience to the Great Commission. Additionally, Paul repeatedly instructs his Gentile readers to obey the law of Moses. In Ephesians 6, he explicitly tells them to obey the fifth commandment. He says to honor your father and mother, and then he quotes it directly. He quotes it straight from Exodus. In Romans 13, he requires Gentiles to, quote, fulfill the law. And he directly quotes Leviticus 19:18, love your neighbor as yourself, and then 4 of the 10 commandments. And he also, after that, he says, quote, and any other commandment. So he quotes Leviticus, quotes 4 of the 10 commandments, and says to fulfill the law, and then he adds, and any other commandment, you're to do that too. So not just the ones he specifically quotes, but also any other commandment. In Romans 8, verse 4, he taught that Spirit-led believers, whether Jew or Gentile, will fulfill the Torah's righteous requirements. So, both the immediate context of Acts 15 and the broader biblical context in the New Testament indicate that the apostles did not consider the Torah irrelevant to Gentiles. Quite the opposite. As we've seen, even within Acts 15 itself, the apostles directly applied Torah commandments to Gentile believers. So, the idea that Acts 15 represents the apostles' rejection of the Torah for Gentiles runs into several problems, as we've seen. Therefore, rather than accepting the common view, I think that these issues, this context, pushes us to consider an alternative position. It pushes us to consider an alternative interpretation. So, after that very long introduction, let's now turn to Acts 15. All right, Acts 15. What is the context here? Well, in the lead up to the Jerusalem Council, we see that the early Messianic Jewish movement was experiencing rapid growth, right? The Spirit was poured out upon the disciples in Acts chapter 2 on the day of Pentecost. Thousands of people are being saved. And this movement that started was originally made up of solely Jewish followers of Jesus, okay? However, after a while, as we keep reading in the book of Acts, we see that many Gentile believers were joining as well, and this was largely due to the missionary work of Paul and Barnabas. Well, Luke writes that after preaching the gospel throughout Asia Minor, Paul and Barnabas, after ministering to Jewish and Gentile believers throughout the region, they returned to Antioch. And then Luke, the author of Acts, he writes that certain men from Judea came to Antioch and began teaching that circumcision was necessary for salvation. So this is what it says in Acts 15, verse 1. But some men came down from Judea and were teaching the brothers, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. End quote. All right? First verse of Acts 15, verse 1, we see the issue. Men from Judea came down and they were teaching that circumcision is necessary for salvation. Now, obviously, the teaching brought by these men from Judea had a pretty big impact on these Gentile believers that Paul and Barnabas were ministering to, right? Unlike Jews who were circumcised on the 8th day of birth, as commanded in the Torah in Leviticus 12, verse 3, Gentiles were uncircumcised. So obviously, requiring circumcision for salvation placed a pretty heavy burden upon these Gentile believers who were coming to faith. They're like, you want me to do what now? Like, I already agreed to accept your Jewish Messiah, and I'm trying to walk this out, and what? So, as we would expect, Luke writes that this issue sparked intense debate between these men from Judea and Paul and Barnabas. And so they're arguing amongst each other. And to resolve this matter, Paul and Barnabas are then appointed to go to Jerusalem to consult with the apostles and elders. Luke goes on to say that when they arrived in Jerusalem, this is verses 2 through 4, when they arrived in Jerusalem, they were warmly welcomed by the apostles and other believers. And then when they get to the council, we see another group who proposes something similar to what the men from Judea were teaching. This is what it says in Acts 15, verse 5. So they're at the council in Jerusalem, and verse 5 says, "But some believers who belonged to the party of the Pharisees rose up and said, 'It is necessary to circumcise them and to order them to keep the law of Moses.'" Okay, so what's going on here? So you have the men from Judea in verse 1, and this group of Pharisees in verse 5, and they insist that Gentile believers must get circumcised. And we should note also that the Pharisees also, in addition to circumcision, insisted that Gentiles must be ordered to keep the law of Moses. So let's focus on the Pharisees first. Okay, so the Pharisees, since they're at the council, and this is the Pharisees' proposal for the council to consider. Well, what does this tell us about the Pharisees' position? It tells us that for these Pharisees, circumcision and Torah observance are inseparable. They go together. You can't just keep the law of Moses as a Gentile. You can't just do that. You have to get circumcised first. It's necessary to get circumcised. You can't just be doing these commandments without circumcision. They have to go together. I want to suggest that that is the real point of disagreement between the apostles and these Pharisees at the council. The disagreement is not really about keeping the law of Moses. It is about circumcision. As we saw earlier, the apostles required uncircumcised Gentiles to keep various commandments from the Torah. So I would argue that what the apostles rejected is the Pharisees' belief or their position that circumcision and keeping the law of Moses are inseparable. The apostles believed that uncircumcised Gentiles could join God's people and obey the Torah as it applies to them. Now, before we go further, we need to talk about circumcision, because I know some of you right now are already thinking, David, the Torah commands circumcision. So if the apostles expected Gentiles to keep Torah, that would require them to get circumcised, right? Well, yes, the Torah does have commandments concerning circumcision, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But before we get there, many might be surprised to learn that this dispute in Acts 15 is not really all that unique in early Judaism. You guys are familiar with Josephus, right? He's a first century Jewish historian. Well, he has had many writings that we have, and he describes a similar situation involving two Jews who had different views on circumcision for Gentiles. In his book, Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus recounts a story which is actually set during the apostles' lifetime about a king named Azates. And Azates was a Gentile, and according to Josephus, a Jew named Ananias convinced King Azates to worship the God of Israel and to adopt these Jewish practices and these commandments from the Torah. So Josephus goes on to say that King Azates became a devoted follower of Judaism. He started keeping the commandments and studying the word and all of that. And eventually, King Azates expressed a desire to get circumcised. So what does Ananias do? Ananias actually goes on to advise the king that circumcision was unnecessary. He said that it was more important that the king worship God and keep the Torah. Listen to what it says in Antiquities of the Jews. This is in Book 20, line 41. Josephus writes, quote, Ananias said the king could worship God even without circumcision if he had fully decided to be zealous for the ancestral laws of the Jews. For this is more decisive than being circumcised. All right, so what's going on here? Well, Ananias thought that it was unnecessary for this Gentile king to get circumcised as long as the king fully decided to be zealous for the, quote, ancestral laws of the Jews, the Torah, the law of Moses. Now, as we continue reading, immediately after Ananias says this, Josephus introduces another Jewish advisor named Eliezer. And Eliezer rebukes Azates for not being circumcised and urges him to do so immediately. So Eliezer, he approaches King Azates. He sees that he's studying the Torah, and he's like, what are you doing? This is hypocritical. You can't be doing this and remain uncircumcised. You have to do that immediately. And as we keep reading, according to Josephus, King Azates is convinced by Eliezer, and then he calls for a surgeon and gets circumcised. But what do we learn from this account? Okay? What do we learn from this account? Well, this account shows us that although you had some early Jews, like Eliezer, who believed that circumcision was necessary for adult Gentiles, other Jews did not believe it was necessary. Other Jews, like Ananias, believed that a Gentile could worship the God of Israel and keep the law of Moses as it applies to him while remaining uncircumcised. So what I want to suggest is that in Acts 15, we kind of see something a little bit similar. It appears that the Pharisees aligned more closely with Eliezer's position, where, it's hypocritical to even study the law of Moses while being uncircumcised. Whereas the apostles took a position that aligned more with Ananias. Now, to be fair, the accounts in Josephus and Acts 15, they're not totally analogous. Ananias believed that if King Azates got circumcised and the citizens found out about it, that it could cause him political problems. So there are other factors at play. But at the very least, this account shows us that not all Jews agreed with the Pharisees, that circumcision and keeping the Torah are inseparable. Some Jews believed that no, a Gentile could keep the Torah while remaining uncircumcised. Okay, but what about the Torah itself? Because that's the real question. What does the law of Moses actually say about this issue? Does the Torah teach that it is necessary for Gentiles to get circumcised? Or can Gentiles be part of the community of Israel and keep the Torah while remaining uncircumcised? So there are 3 passages in the Torah that give instructions for circumcision, and 2 of those passages are irrelevant to what's going on here in Acts 15. Why do I say that? Because 2 of those passages have nothing to do with grown adult Gentiles. For instance, Leviticus 12 verse 3 says, "On the 8th day the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised." And this is talking about an 8-day-old baby Israelite, right? The commandment is for Israelite parents to circumcise their male infants on the 8th day. Obviously, the baby isn't going to do it himself. He's 8 days old. So his parents do it, all right? Nothing about adult Gentiles in that commandment. The commandment says nothing about whether an adult Gentile should get circumcised, the commandment is for an Israelite parent to circumcise her sons, to circumcise her son on the 8th day. We see the same thing, by the way, in Genesis 17, which is the basis for the command in Leviticus that we just read. Here, too, the law applies to physical sons of Abraham who became the Israelites, and it is to be carried out by the parents on the 8th day, starting with Isaac, okay? So once again, the commandment is not for adult Gentiles to get circumcised. It is for parents to circumcise their infants. So not really relevant to what we see going on in Acts 15. Now, someone might ask, well, don't these commandments imply that a Gentile needed to get circumcised in order to join God's people? Because, God's people, they're to be circumcised on the 8th day. So if you want to be part of that, you need to get circumcised, right? Well, some Jews apparently did think that. Some Jews apparently did take that position. You have the men from Judea, right, that we see in Acts 15, verse 1. They said you can't even be saved unless you're circumcised. And we also see that with Eliezer in the account with Josephus. So there were some Jews that believed that your salvation depended upon getting circumcised, and that if a Gentile wanted to join the people of Israel, if he wanted to join God's people, he had to do that. That's also what Paul is countering in the book of Galatians, right? However, as we will see, the Torah itself assumes that uncircumcised Gentiles who follow the God of Israel should be welcomed into the community without being circumcised. In the Torah itself, contrary to the opinions of some Jews in the first century, in the Torah itself, uncircumcised Gentiles who follow the God of Israel should be welcomed into the community without being circumcised. And that brings us to Exodus 12, verse 48. So unlike the other two commandments about circumcision that we talked about, this passage does address the matter of circumcision for adults who are not physical sons of Abraham. This commandment, it appears within the context of eating the lamb that is sacrificed at Passover. And this is what it says in chapter 12, verse 48. It says, quote, "If a stranger shall sojourn with you and would keep the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised. Then he may come near and eat it, or keep it. He shall be as a native of the land, but no uncircumcised person shall eat of it." Okay, so what's going on? Well, here we are told that a stranger can eat the Passover, and specifically it's talking about the sacrificial lamb here. It's talking about the meat of the sacrifice. We are told that a stranger can eat the Passover only if he gets circumcised. What is a stranger? A stranger is a non-Israelite. A non-Israelite who has joined the Israelite community and has decided to worship the God of Israel. In other words, he is a Gentile. Okay? So once again, this is the only time when the Torah gives any instructions regarding circumcision for grown adult Gentiles. So what exactly does this commandment in Exodus 12 require? Does it require adult Gentiles to get circumcised? Well, yes and no. A stranger does need to get circumcised if he wishes to be allowed to eat the Passover lamb. Okay? We could think about ritual washing. Passover is a sacrifice, right? And so if you wanted to worship at the tabernacle or a temple, there was a proper protocol for being able to do that. You'd have to go through certain rituals and washings to enter a state of ritual purity in order to be able to participate. I think, perhaps the same logic is going on here. You have to be circumcised in order to partake of this sacrifice. So, however, and this is important, yes, a stranger does need to get circumcised to eat the Passover lamb. However, there is no general commandment for adult Gentiles to get circumcised. In fact, this verse proves that uncircumcised strangers were welcomed among the people of Israel. Notice that this stranger is uncircumcised, hence the command to get circumcised, which means he wasn't, all right? So he's uncircumcised, hence the command to get circumcised in order to eat the sacrificial meat. Why is that significant? Because the Torah itself repeatedly includes uncircumcised strangers in the community and requires them to obey God's commandments. For instance, they can't eat the Passover lamb, okay? But earlier in the same chapter in Exodus 12, verse 19, we see that strangers are still required to keep the other aspects of Passover, such as abstaining from leaven for 7 days. The command specifically says, whether you are an Israelite or a stranger, you shall abstain from leaven for 7 days. And it even comes with the threat of being cut off if you don't do so, which is, if you can be cut off, that assumes that you are part of something. So uncircumcised strangers are part of the congregation of Israel, and they have to keep the days of unleavened bread. Elsewhere in the Torah, we see these uncircumcised strangers are expected to do things like keep the Sabbath and the festivals and many other laws, even laws regarding purity and offerings. So according to the Torah itself, the Pharisees in Acts 15 are wrong. According to the Torah itself, the Pharisees in Acts 15 are wrong. Circumcision and keeping the law of Moses are not inseparable. This is important because, again, like I said at the beginning, many people approach this text and they just assume that the apostles were rejecting or ignoring the law of Moses. No, they did not reject the Torah. They did not think it was necessary for these Gentiles to get circumcised. Why? Because the Torah does not say that it is necessary. It was only necessary to eat the Passover lamb. Presumably, a stranger, an uncircumcised stranger, could be part of the people of Israel and participate in every other aspect of Torah life while remaining uncircumcised. He just can't eat the lamb. So, with that, let's get back to Acts 15. I'm just going to summarize the rest of this because I want to get down to verse 20, and I know we've already been going kind of long here. But okay, so we read in verse 5, right? The Pharisees, they insist that Gentiles must get circumcised, and then Peter goes on to give a speech. He talks about how he saw with his own eyes that these uncircumcised Gentiles were being saved and they were receiving the Spirit. We read about this in Acts 10 and 11, right? And so Peter's argument is simple. He's like, listen, guys, God already received these Gentiles, even though they are uncircumcised, so we should receive them too. If God received them, we should receive them. After all, we're all saved by grace through faith. We're all saved by the grace of the Messiah. None of us are saved by circumcision or Torah observance. So we should not put that burden on the Gentiles. Following Peter's speech, James then gives biblical support for Peter's argument. He cites Amos 9, verses 11 through 12, which James sees as a prophecy that predicts the nations turning to the God of Israel and keeping his commandments. So, all of this leads James to reject the Pharisees' proposal, and he goes on to give his conclusion. He's like, okay, what's to be done with these Gentiles? And he concludes that instead of circumcision, they must follow these 4 commandments. And so this is what it says in starting in verse 19 of Acts 15. James is speaking, and he says, quote, "Therefore my judgment is that we should not trouble those of the Gentiles who turn to God, but should write to them to abstain from the things polluted by idols, and from sexual immorality, and from what has been strangled, and from blood." Okay? So he gives these 4 commandments, and what does he say? He says, instead of getting circumcised, the Gentiles are required to obey these 4 commandments: 3 food laws and a prohibition against sexual immorality. By the way, just really quick, things polluted by idols, it refers to food offered to idols, right? Strangled things refers to meat that was improperly slaughtered so that it wasn't properly drained of blood. We see this in Philo. He talks about strangled meat, and he uses that word to refer to meat that still contains the blood. And of course, blood refers to not eating blood. So where did these commandments come from, and what was their purpose? Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, all 4 of these commandments come straight out of the law of Moses. They come from Leviticus 17 through 18. So again, contrary to popular belief, the apostles were not rejecting the Torah. They explicitly imposed 4 commandments from the Torah onto Gentile believers. Okay, but why did the apostles choose these specific commandments for Gentiles? Seems kind of random. Why these 4? Well, remember, according to the Torah, uncircumcised strangers, that is Gentiles, they could be welcomed into the community and they could belong to the people of Israel and keep the commandments that applied to them. They can't eat the Passover lamb, but they were expected to keep many other laws. So I would suggest that it seems that the apostles chose these 4 commandments because these 4 commandments are what the Torah applies to not only Israel, but also the stranger. When you look at these laws in Leviticus, where they're found in chapters 17 and 18 in Leviticus, the stranger is explicitly mentioned. It says, not only are you, Israel, to do this, but also the stranger among you, in the context of the Jerusalem Council. What was their purpose in this context? Well, we know what their purpose was not. We know what their purpose was not, okay? They were not a comprehensive set of commandments for Gentiles. In other words, the apostles did not think that Gentiles were restricted to only these 4 commandments for all time. This should be obvious because nobody thinks that Gentile believers are permitted to murder, steal, or lie, despite the fact that those are not mentioned in Acts 15, verse 20. Elsewhere in the New Testament, as well as in the Torah itself, Gentiles are given many other commandments beyond these 4 prohibitions. Many other times throughout the Torah, it says, not only are you to keep this law, Israel, but also the stranger who sojourns among you. So, if these 4 prohibitions are not meant as a comprehensive set of commandments, then what is their purpose? What is the purpose of these 4 commandments? The simplest explanation, in my opinion, is that they provide a starting point for fellowship in place of circumcision. They provide a starting point for fellowship in place of circumcision. Again, the apostles are just agreeing with the law of Moses. They're looking at the law of Moses, they're seeing what applies to the Gentiles, and they see that Gentiles do not need to get circumcised to sojourn with Israel, but they do need to do these 4 things. So I would suggest that the 4 commandments are the minimum starting point for fellowship with Messianic Jews. They are not a substitute for Torah observance, but they are an introduction to Torah observance. Okay? So instead of requiring immediate adherence to all the laws in the Torah that apply to Gentiles, the apostles expected that Gentile believers would gradually grow in their Torah observance over time. And that leads to the next verse, verse 21. Verse 21 says, "For from ancient generations Moses has had in every city those who proclaim him, for he is read every Sabbath in the synagogues." So the law of Moses is read every Sabbath in the synagogues. All right, as I explained at the beginning, this verse explains why the 4 prohibitions are given to Gentile believers. I would argue, and I'm just repeating what other scholars have said, but I would argue that James views the weekly proclamation of Moses in the synagogues as a resource for Gentile discipleship. He looks at the preaching of Moses in the synagogues on the Sabbath as a resource for Gentile discipleship. According to the apostles, the 4 commandments are the minimum requirements to sojourn among Israel. And the apostles expected Gentiles to pick up more commandments that applied to them over time as they hear Moses proclaimed every Sabbath in the synagogues. Here's how Dr. Eyal Regev puts it. He's a New Testament scholar. He writes, quote, "The implications of verse 21 are that since the Torah is proclaimed and studied in the synagogue on a regular basis, the God-fearing Christians would gain further knowledge and adhere to Jewish law after being accepted into the Jewish Christian community. The legal obligations of the Apostolic Decree may have been an invitation to observe Jewish law." End quote. All right, so the apostles essentially give a twofold response to the Pharisees' twofold proposal. What was the Pharisees' twofold proposal in verse 5? They said it is necessary, 1, to circumcise them, and 2, order them to keep the law of Moses. So how did the apostles respond? What did the apostles decide? The apostles decided that instead of circumcision, Gentile believers must keep the 4 commandments required to sojourn among Israel. And instead of ordering them to keep the law of Moses, the apostles expected Gentiles to hear the law of Moses proclaimed in the synagogues every Sabbath. Okay? So the apostles did not reject the law of Moses, they applied it correctly and graciously. The Gentiles, they were to be included into the community without circumcision, just like the sojourner was, the stranger in the Hebrew Scriptures. They were to be included in the community without circumcision, and they were to learn all the commandments that applied to them over time as they were discipled, and they learned more and they heard the Scriptures more. Now, of course, one natural consequence of the disciples' decision here is that Gentile believers would then automatically start to align their lives with the Jewish calendar. They would be fellowshipping with Messianic Jews in the synagogues when? On the Sabbath. Okay? So it should be noted, by the way, that the Sabbath and festivals are also among the laws that the Torah explicitly applies to the stranger who sojourns among Israel. So to sum up, the apostles, they reject the Pharisees' proposal. They say, no, instead of circumcision, Gentiles, you need to keep 4 commandments as a starting point for fellowship. And verse 21 shows that through hearing Moses proclaimed in the synagogues, Gentiles would gradually and naturally grow in their observance over time. Far from rejecting the Torah or exempting Gentiles from keeping the Torah, the apostles impose 4 Torah commandments upon them, and they expect them to learn and obey more Torah over time. All right, now, I know that some of you might be thinking, all right, that's very interesting, but what does any of this have to do with me? Well, much in every way. First, we should avoid sexual immorality. We should avoid eating food offered to idols, blood, and strangled things. That's a very direct commandment from the apostles. This verse 20 of Acts 15, it's called the Apostles' Decree. That's the name that it came to be known by. And yeah, I think these are 4 things that we need to make sure that we are doing. These are like the Torah basics. And the apostles directly imposed these laws upon all believers as a mandatory minimum. Surprisingly, many Christians don't even think that these 4 laws continued to be relevant. Forget about the rest of the Torah that we always talk about, the Sabbath and the festivals and all of that. I've encountered Christians recently, to my astonishment, who argue that even these 4 laws are irrelevant now, and we don't have to worry about these 4 laws. I'm like, what are you talking about? It's literally called the Apostles' Decree. But I recently posted on X, and I posted something that I thought was a very uncontroversial point, which is that, hey, the gist of it was, hey, we should be following the Apostles' Decree in Acts 15:20. And I was literally getting called satanic. I'm not kidding you. People called me satanic for saying that we should follow the Apostles' Decree. Other people called me a Judaizing heretic and all of this stuff. I'm like, it's the Apostles' Decree, guys. It's agreeing with the apostles. What are you talking about? So I think that too many Christians, they have such an aversion to rules, right? And honestly, I think that this aversion to rules, that even the 4 commandments that the apostles gave as the basic minimum requirements, even those are too much. And well, you don't want to be a legalist, right? And there's such an aversion to rules that I think that this kind of accounts for a lot of the problems that we see in the church. I mean, we see a lot of problems with sexual immorality and scandals among church leaders. It's because people are not following the Apostolic Decree. They're not following Acts 15, verse 20, that explicitly commands us not to engage in sexual immorality. The second thing we learn is that the apostles had a biblical standard. The apostles had a biblical standard. As we saw, contrary to popular belief, the apostles did not throw out the law of Moses. They applied it, okay? So we should ask ourselves, am I applying the law of Moses? Do I live by the biblical standard that the apostles lived by, or do I try to find ways to get out of what the Bible says? I was playing Sorry with my son recently. It's a board game. And during the game, he kept disregarding rules that didn't benefit him in the game. And, he's 6. So, of course, I mean, all 6-year-olds do that. And but I was trying to explain to him. I'm like, Ezra, the game doesn't really work if you ignore the rules. There has to be a standard. Otherwise, it's not Sorry anymore. You can't even call the game Sorry. You have to change the name to, I don't know, My Apologies or My Pardon or something. But it's not Sorry. There's rules to the game, and there's a standard to playing the game. And so similarly, can you really call it Christianity if you ignore the rules, if you ignore the standard that the apostles lived by and that God gave us in the Torah? I guess you could. You can't call it biblical Christianity. But, the apostles had a biblical standard, and we need to make sure that we are also upholding that biblical standard. A third point I want to mention is that inclusion must come before expecting someone to have everything right. Inclusion must come before expecting someone to have everything right. Now, to be clear, this does not mean that we throw out the standard. Again, the apostles still held to Scripture as the standard, but they differed from the Pharisees in 2 ways. Number 1, the apostles' standard was biblical. I believe that the apostles had the correct interpretation of the Torah, as I explained, and the Pharisees, they were misreading the Torah. The second way that they differed from the Pharisees is that they were willing to meet people where they were. They were willing to meet people where they were. They said, you don't have to have it all together all at once. Here are a few things to start off with. Come to synagogue on the Sabbath. You'll hear Moses preached and you'll learn more. So the Pharisees' approach is like if a porn star got saved and people immediately told her that she can't come to church unless she quit smoking and stopped downloading movies illegally from the internet and changed all of these parts of her life. You have to do all of this stuff. You can't be part of our community unless you fix all of these things in your life first. Now, some of those things are a good idea, obviously, and one would hope that over time she might feel convicted to start doing these other things that go against biblical teaching. But talk about misplaced priorities. The first thing she should do is quit the porn industry, right? That's the first thing that she should do. One of the 4 prohibitions is to abstain from sexual immorality. So start there. And then, the other things will come over time. It would be dumb to exclude such a person just because she doesn't yet realize that she shouldn't eat pork or something, for example, right? That other stuff will come naturally as she hears Moses proclaimed every Sabbath in the synagogue. The priority is meeting people where they are and giving them a place to start. The priority is to include people so that they can be discipled. All right. Worship team, you could come back up if you're ready. So I hope this message was encouraging to you guys. I know it was a lot of information, but if there is anything that I hope we can take away from Acts 15, it's that God's word remains relevant and applicable. It's not done away with, and our job is not to add to it or take away from it. Our job is to study it, to know what it says, and to apply it correctly. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this day. Thank you so much for your word, Lord. And I pray that whatever I said today that was true and that was biblical, Lord, that it would impact your people, that they would be blessed and edified, that this would be part of their discipleship to move forward and to grow in your ways. If anything that I said today was unbiblical, Lord, I pray that it will not have an impact. Lord, we just want to be faithful to your word. We just want to be faithful to your biblical standard, and we just want to understand it and apply it. Lord, we love you. We thank you. We praise all these things in your Son, Yeshua's name. Amen.